Okay. Okay. So,
What's your name again? Sorry.
Andrew Johnson.
Andrew.
I'm Andrew Johnson. And you are Professor Timothy at Paglionea.
Yes.
You are a professor of astronomy
And physics.
Astronomy and physics.
Mm-hmm. And chair of the Department of Earth and Physical Sciences.
All right. So, you are astronomy professor. What got you into astronomy?
Yeah, it's a very common question. I'd always been interested in math and science my whole life, even as a little kid. And my father was an engineer, so I had a lot of encouragement.
An engineer with what? And where? NASA? Or?
No, he was an electrical engineer with, what's it called nowadays? It's the Sarnoff, I don't know what it's called now, but it was RCA Labs when he started in Princeton, and then it was Sarnoff now, Sarnoff Labs.
And what did they produce? For at least maybe for space. Did it produce anything for space? Or?
They did. There was some space stuff that they worked on.
What in particular?
Oh, gee. I mean, Sarnoff Labs has been around for decades. So
The Apollo, the space shuttle?
No.
Nothing for.
They had some contracts early on for the International Space Station, but those didn't pan out. You know, a lot of communications equipment, things like that. That was sort of their specialty in that area at Sarnoff. Communications
equipment. Mm-hmm. For what programs? The space shuttle, the Apollo, or Gemini?
No.
For none.
No.
For
no. Some special communication satellites, things like that. There was another organization several miles away, near Sarnoff, which was RCA Astro, and they did a lot of the specific space development. But anyway, my father was an engineer, and so he was able to give me a lot of support for my interests in math and science and engineering. And so, you know, I had all the, you know, chemistry kits and electronic kits and games and Legos and stuff like that when I was a kid, and including a small telescope that I borrowed from my uncle. And just somewhere along the line, after I learned all the constellations as a teenager, it just stuck. And the more classes I took in school on chemistry and physics, the more I loved it.
Where did you live as a kid?
In central New Jersey.
Central New Jersey? When were you born?
1968.
1968? Were you around, obviously you were too young for moon landings.
No, the moon landings started in '69.
I said you were too young to really witness it.
I vaguely remember some of the last ones, which the last landing was in '72 or '73.
Yes, late 1972. Obviously, everyone saw the space shuttle program.
Mm-hmm.
So
I even saw a launch back in
person?
2009. Yeah. I was
Which one?
down.
SDS?
It was 130. STS-130. This was the one that brought the cupola to the International Space Station. This is the sort of American skylight,
Okay.
and that was what they launched. It was the last night launch. It went up at about 4:30 in the morning. It was amazing. Yeah, really amazing.
Okay, so you went, and then you went to college. Which college?
I went to Stevens Institute of Technology.
Yeah, and you majored in physics or astronomy?
Physics, yeah.
And then you majored in astronomy in graduate school.
That's right, at Boston University.
Boston University. Let me think of this. So were you part of any astronomy clubs as a kid, or any science clubs?
When I was in high school, there was a computer club that I joined. Computers were relatively, I mean, like home computers were relatively new in the 80s. This is the late 80s, so we're talking, you know, Commodore 64 kind of things. So I, you know, that was basically it. I mean, most of the clubs I was part of were not technically related. Sports and the drama, you know, doing
You went to
plays.
sports?
Mm-hmm.
What sports did you play in high school?
In high school, I did some wrestling and I played a lot of tennis. I wasn't on the tennis team, but I played a lot of tennis for fun, and skiing and stuff like that, and softball, a lot of softball.
So you're a wrestler?
I was, yeah. When
On
I
the
was
wrestling
young.
team?
Yeah, very briefly. And I wrestled in grammar school. I wasn't good, but I really liked it a lot. It was fun, but I was terrible.
Okay. So, like, when you were a kid and you bought that telescope, and you got the telescope from your relatives,
Mm-hmm.
did you see all the not all the planets, but did you see any planets?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I looked at the moon and Jupiter and things like that. It was a really small telescope and very difficult to use and very old. So I learned a lot of patience and a lot of good technique. And then when I was about 17 or 18, I saved up and bought my own larger telescope that was much nicer. And that's when I really started to look at galaxies and nebulae and planets in better detail, you know, for fun on my own. And I still have it.
You still have it?
Mm-hmm.
Is that?
No, it's at home. It's very dusty sitting at home.
Oh wait, who manufactured the first telescope you got?
I have no idea.
The one you bought the one you eventually bought.
The one I eventually bought. Oh, who did that? They're out of business now. I can't remember. What the company was called. But they're out of business now, so it doesn't matter.
Okay. So, what was it like studying the? Okay, I know it may sound like a silly question, but just for detail, what was it like studying the fields of physics and astronomy in college?
It was difficult, but great fun. I mean, I really loved physics. I always have, and it's been so much fun since then. It was great to get into, you know, really start to learn this stuff in more detail, and especially the advanced courses were just really eye-opening and so much fun. You know, to learn about, you know, what really makes the world work, and how things work. Especially quantum mechanics was a real eye-opener for me, and a lot of fun. So studying it was great, and I went to an engineering school, so everybody there was sort of in the same boat. We were all very, you know, technically oriented, and it was nice to be among my peers. It was very, very fun.
Wait, repeat the engineering school's name again?
Stevens Institute of Technology.
Mm-hmm. Stevens Institute of Technology.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What person, I always think about this when it comes to people, when it comes to a certain field, which person was perhaps the most influential in shaping your mind? Like, for instance, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Carl Sagan was a person that influenced Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Mm-hmm.
Who influenced you?
Well, Carl Sagan, with his Cosmos program in 1980, maybe 81, definitely was inspiring to me. I certainly looked forward to it and watched every episode. There were a few. There was this guy on late night TV that was so fun to watch. His name was Jack Horkheimer. He was the Star Hustler, and so, you know, if you were up at like some crazy hour of the evening, like his show came on for 10 minutes. It used to come on like Channel 11 or something, and 1 in the morning, you know, all of a sudden Jack Horkheimer would pop up and he'd tell you what the constellations were up tonight, you know, what you should be looking at tonight and stuff. He was a lot of fun. I didn't have any particular role models or anything. I mean, there was a lot of influences that got me excited. It was mostly just the night sky itself. I spent a whole winter memorizing the wintertime constellations, and then I put the book away, you know, and then one summer evening, I looked out in the night sky and I saw a whole bunch of constellations I didn't recognize. I hadn't realized when I was, 12, that the sky was completely different at different seasons. And so then I sat down and learned all the summer constellations. And at that point I was really, really hooked. So it was mostly the constellations that got me hooked. I also had a very good chemistry and physics teacher in high school who was it really sort of solidified for me that this is what I wanted to do, and he was a lot of fun and a very good teacher. So that was also another important thing. But I didn't have a particular role model.
What was that teacher's name?
Mr. Hochschild.
How do you spell that name?
Hoschchild. Hochschild. Yeah, Mr. Hochschild. He was my chemistry and physics teacher in high school.
Have you had contact with him?
When I got into grad school, I did go back and touch base with him. He remembered me 4 years later, and we chatted for a little while. But he's not at that high school anymore, so I think he moved on after a little while.
Is he still alive, or?
I have no idea. Yeah. I would imagine so. He was relatively young, so unless he got sick or something. I'm sure he just moved on. He even back then in the 80s, he built computers and things. So I suspect he got a job outside of teaching and just left that behind. But he was a good teacher, so it's a loss.
So after college, after graduate school, where did you first work?
So my first postdoc, as we call it, was at, are you ready? The Instituto Nacional de Astrofísica, Óptica y Electrónica, the INAOE, or just INAOE. It's in central Mexico. So I left the country for a couple of years for my first postdoc. So this is the National Institute for Astrophysics, Optics, and Electronics. And it's in Puebla, Mexico. And I moved there because there was a collaboration between INAOE and the University of Massachusetts to build a 50-meter radio telescope in Mexico. And it's called the LMT, the Large Millimeter Telescope. And at the time, they were just building their radio astronomer group at INAOE. So I was one of the relatively new radio astronomers down there. And the LMT is now working. It's completely built, and they're just sort of fine-tuning the surface and getting it up to speed. So it's pretty exciting. I hope to use it in the next year or so.
What has the LMT helped discover?
Well, it's just getting started. They just completed the dish a couple years ago and got the receivers on and have been making the first measurements. So it's taking, it's in its infancy, so it's taking some early steps at just getting up and running still. So they're still going through all the engineering phases. So it hasn't done anything at the discovery level yet, but it will.
Wait, when did you start building it? When did you go down and start building?
Well, I started there at the end of '96, and it was it didn't even have a location. The site hadn't even been chosen then. So by '99, when I left the project, we had a site located, and we had a contractor for the design and construction. And then it takes several years to get the design approved and for the funding to move forward and to actually start construction. And then it takes several years to complete construction. And now construction's nearly complete, and they're just working on the final touches to get the dish surface to the proper specifications, and all the receivers I believe all the receivers are on board now and working. So it's just a matter of fine-tuning it so that the community is able to start using it. It's a long process to get a telescope up and running.
A radio telescope, not your typical optical.
No, it's a radio telescope. It has a big dish. It's huge.
It's gray-colored dish or something.
Yeah, it's 50 meters across. 150 feet, so it's enormous.